Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are loud and clear. Please go on.
Okay. I'll take my PRS2 first. Unanimous Vision 3, 2, 1. I know the working class are currently facing the greatest economic threat to their livelihoods in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, in the wake of growing oil prices, in the wake of economic collapse. While the poor die and languish in the status quo, the rich and rich corporations continue to get richer and profit off the suffering of individuals. Corporations like Facebook and Amazon are literally worth more than entire countries. We think that this is abhorrent on several practical levels, but also on the most basic fundamental moral level that individuals should be treated as they deserve to be as human beings. A few pieces of setup as to what we support on our side of the house. The first is to note what this global minimum tax actually looks like. We think it looks like two key things. Firstly, it is a 15% tax of corporate revenue that goes towards directly government coffers. So this is tax money that directly goes from these corporations to the government, very simply. I don't think this is likely to be insignificant to these companies. We think this is likely billions and billions of dollars, new money that is going within these governments that they're able to spend. Secondly, we think we specifically target the excess profit margin of large corporations. We think this is likely to be damaging for these companies, but we are willing to take that bullet and we are willing to trade this off immediately because we want it to be damaging, because we want people to live. The last thing to note here is that governments are going to use this money to do basic things and enhance spending in the populace, things like healthcare, things like education. All of these things are incredibly, like I think by basis of the motion, are far better on our side of the house insofar as we get billions more dollars to spend into marginalized communities and improve their education systems. A lot of impacting on that later. The second thing on this setup is specifically corporations and who this debate is about. I think it is the case that this 15% thing is likely to be perfect insofar as it doesn't completely cripple these companies, but still does damage. The second thing to note here is probably we're talking about corporations generally. We're looking at rich corporations because we think they're the true actor of this debate, but we're happy to extend this to smaller corporations also, if that is something that we're willing to defend. A few pieces of framing as to why we win this round from the beginning. The first here is that corporations under the status quo of the tax structure on their side of the house, practically are given the free ability to hoard a massive amount of wealth and monopolize. They will always have an incentive to do so, and this is unlikely to change even in regards to reform, because the first thing to note here is that corporations are directly a product of the free market and directly a product of profit business incentives. So they will always want to hoard wealth because that's always the incentive of rich individuals who control these companies. Even if the people control these companies, they still want to profit at any point in time. The people here who are important and we need to protect in this debate are the working class individuals who on their side of the house are currently facing an economic crisis. The first thing I'm going to talk about in terms of argumentation is why this is something that is just. I think this is the case for three reasons. The first is because it is a direct act of self-defense. I think this frames out all the principal arguments, by the way. The second thing here is why I think this tax structure or the system of taxes is not something that is unintuitive to most people. I think it is something that's found everywhere. Insofar as opposition are going to make the argument that tax is unjust, I'm going to ask them the question why tax is just for people in the first place. The third reason here is that I think tax is something that is necessary. The first argument, therefore, is why this actively benefits the poor and actively decreases the amount of harm that these companies can cause. Secondly, why this better protects the developing world from exploitation of corporations. But before that, any points of clarification? Okay, that's great. There are three problems, the structural problems that we identify in the status quo. The first is that the private sector has managed to grab hold of nations' wealth, which directly comes at the cost of millions of underpaid and impoverished citizens, which is to say the working class. We think that every dollar that corporations make off the top of existing excessive profit margins is a dollar that is taken away from the individuals who need it most. We are talking about these single moms here who aren't able to afford rent, unable to afford diapers for their kids, because these are corporations that underpay them at any point in time and are able to do this because they have an excessive profit margin that they're able to use against them in order to decrease the minimum wage and things like that. There are several ways in which corporations are bad actors who engage in these harmful corporate practices. The first thing that they do is they always strip away workers' rights any chance that they can, because they're able to do things like squash worker unions, for instance, with their excessive amount of money. They're able to force absurd working hours upon their employees, because at that point in time when they have monopolized the industry, these workers don't really have a choice but to opt into these companies, and therefore strips away at their agency. We think this is in line, always going to be in line with their profit incentive, and is never going to change. The second thing they're able to do is use money to quash opposition companies. And this is the thing about monopolization, which I also think is a big part of this debate. We think in terms of growth and in terms of economic growth that these companies can bring, monopolies are terrible for this because they're able to go look at other opposition companies who are producing the same product and say, I have far more money than you, and therefore I'm able to buy over your company and never allow you to develop any form of new innovation, and they're able to monopolize the market at that point in time. You don't get any growth on opposition. The third thing that they're able to do is pervert the political system and lobby policies that are actively terrible for people. The gun lobby in the United States has literally led to like thousands of individuals, thousands of innocent children dead because companies like the NRA and like other companies that make up the gun lobby actively fight against anti-gun policies within Parliament. The third thing I want to know about why they're problematic is that corporations are able to stagnate and slow development here. They don't have an accountability mechanism because they're crazy rich. They can just pay people and like bribe people to not like hold them accountable. Also, like they're just giving the real people who are control of the political system are the rich, are the people who control these companies in the first place. The second and last thing to say, they don't have an incentive to grow anyways. We solve this problem with two structural solutions. The first is that we diminish to a large extent the ability for corporations to do this. And what we do is we force these companies to cut off an external budget for politics, things like harmful wealth hoarding. We don't think they can just throw money around at a point in time which 15% of their profit revenue is taken away from them. We immediately take a tool out of their toolbox and reduce the amount of harm that they commit. I just want to know here in terms of the burdens, we don't have to prove that these companies are going to stop this completely. Insofar as we're able to prove a substantial amount of change that these companies are able to are going through, I think that is enough to win this debate, because that is still millions of people who we save. The second thing that we do structurally is we redistribute a massive bankload of money to the people in the interest of human development. I'm sorry if I didn't take a POI, or if you didn't, like if you asked one, because I didn't hear it. The first thing that we're able to do is governments now have the budget to spend on developing healthcare, things like education, things like infrastructure for the most poor individuals and the most poor communities. I think this is our trade-off. I don't really care what opposition is able to prove, because we cannot sit around in this debate and wait for the most disenfranchised in our society to just uplift themselves. We need to do it through direct action, and the way we do this is taxing these companies. The second thing that we're able to prove is that governments, even in the worst case of marginal inefficiency, still have a vested interest in the people. So even if it is within the government, we think governments are democratically elected, they're subject to voter bases, they're subject to popular support. They always have to work in the interest of people, because that's just how democracy works. Lastly, the last thing about why this protects developing countries, this is pretty straightforward. We think a big reason why corporations enter and underpay in places like Bangladesh and Thailand is because things like because they're able to exploit these tax structures. We think what we do is we force these companies to no longer be able to benefit from easy tax rates from these like developing nations, and make it incredibly difficult for companies like Nike to set up large international networks at high scale. The impact of this in our case is pretty clear. The first is that we strengthen the developing world against first world corporate exploitation, which is another million people that we protect. But secondly, we allow for natural and healthy companies to develop and take control without absurd profit. For those reasons, we are very proud to propose.
Thank you so much, PM, for that fine speech. Do I have the permission of other panelists to move on with the debate, assuming they are ready? Judges, are you ready to move on?
Yep, fine, Varun.
Okay. Is the other judge ready?
Yep, I'm ready.
Okay, cool. So let's have leader of opposition to continue the debate. Here.
Okay, verbal PR speech starting in 3, 2, 1. It's simply that you take more away from these companies, they're continuing to take more away from the people, right? They've said to you that they are profit driven, and we think that this is something that's not going to change, but it's going to be even more evil towards all of the people that they're trying to protect today. So a few layers of responses, right? They firstly said that big companies are profit driven and they squash away like the rights of the workers, right? But we still think that they don't solve these problems to a very much extent, because we think that there's still a lot of things that they are willing to do in order to secure their profits, like cutting off the fundings that they have for human resources, right? We think that this is a problem that they have to face either way, which probably means that when these companies are profit driven, they have the incentivized to continue to squash all of these workers in order to get as much back from what they've given out to the government itself. So we therefore think that this is counterproductive. But we also think that the stakeholders that should be included in today's debate are the small companies or big companies that invest in developing states and third world countries, as well as the people there, because they're the most vulnerable actor without any financial capital or social capital to begin with. So the world we support is simply in status quo, where different countries is able to set different taxes in order to attract like different foreign investments and gives them incentive to invest in these countries. I'll take it later. So the first argument that we have today is how you actively disincentivize these companies to invest in third world nations. So firstly, on the characteristics of developing nations, right? We firstly think that they are highly reliant on foreign investments and big companies. This looks like fast fashion companies like Zara or Uniqlo, or factories which move their headquarters to developing nations because of low tax rates and labor forces, right? This is true because firstly, people are vulnerable. They have no access towards education because A, their families are poor. They don't have a stable income because of the lack of skill sets, right? But we also think that secondly, the government of these developing nations are the best actors for this because of how economically unstable the country is and how they are highly reliant on foreign investments, right? So we think that on the second layer, this happens because when companies who are profit-driven pull out from these developing nations because of the increasing tax rates, we tell that it's harmful because they take away job opportunities from these people, right? This means that the people in developing states who live from paycheck to paycheck or work in these factories who are only willing to accept them because it requires little skill set but long hours of work is going to pull out or is going to cut off fundings towards these workers in the first place, and we therefore think that this is harmful, right? The impact of this is firstly, we at least allow them to put food on the table where these companies are still willing to invest and these companies are still willing to stay in these countries and provide them a steady flow of income, right? But secondly, we tell that they're able to work because companies need to profit and companies are profit hungry in the first place, so they hire these people, right? This is a significant harm that way off the long-term benefits of infrastructure and whatever, because they need immediate income to put food on their table and to keep their family at home alive, right? This simply cannot be delayed, right? The $5 they get out from their bosses today goes to like buying bread and rice for their 3-year-old child at home. They don't have the time to wait for better infrastructures to actually happen or like to better the education system and all of these long-term benefits, right? We tell that even if they might be a little bit exploitive, we tell that it's at least better that we cater towards these people, and it's at least better that we allow them to still survive and have little capital and to make use of these capital in the long term. POI.
The companies that you identify are currently and undeniably corrupt. This claim of companies helping these individuals is severely out of this debate. How is a sweatshop by Nike within these areas going to empower you as a poor individual in Venezuela?
We don't say that they empower and we don't say that they are saints who like genuinely care about their rights, but we think that it's important because these people who have little skill set, they depend on working in these factories and working as working long hours and 24-hour shifts in these countries because they need this money and because they don't have skill sets, right? It's simple that when they are willing to invest and they are willing to stay there, these people still keep their jobs. And we tell that there's no other like alternatives that they're able to seek for because they're able to seek for because they're low in education, right? Second argument today is how you kill off small companies under their safety house, right? We think that this tax goes for all businesses that they have said and they are willing to accept this fact, right? So we think that on government, the tax is super high now, which means that small companies will have to pay these high taxes while being like having all of these problems that they have to face, like the lack of capital and money and resources in the first place, right? This is not just like $100, but a few 10,000s of capital from the very limited resources that you already have. And we tell you the consequences that you lead to is the bankruptcy of these small companies. And we therefore think that this is important. So how this works firstly is that otherwise these form of money can go into like improving the company as a whole, like hiring new people and offering like more lucrative in contracts for your workers to stay there, right? But secondly, this looks like building up the businesses and like gaining more investments or improving the quality of products through research, right? We tell them these capitals are important for these small companies to continue to be there and continue to stay alive, right? The importance towards all of these things is that these small companies are particularly important because they are the ones who act as the main tool to build to boost economic stimulus because they act as revenue streams and capital hubs, right? But secondly, we say that they create direct competition for all the exploitative, like big companies that they say they hate so much under their side, right? We tell them when they it creates a competitive we tell that they are direct competition for these companies because they exist there to take away these consumers because they are able to provide better products or cheaper products in the first place, right? When they take away these when they take away the resources from these companies and don't allow them to grow and don't allow them to continue to better their products, we tell them you just create more opportunities for these companies to monopolize these industries because these small companies are now bankrupt and they are now killed off because all of their workers will be cut off because of the lack of resources. And they turn to big companies that are exploitative and those who take away money from the developing states. Right? So we therefore tell you that when you do this, it's counterproductive. You directly take away competition and you solve this one problem, but you create a new problem, which allows them to continue to monopolize these industries, and all of the harms that they propose will continue to happen. Proud to oppose.
Thank you so much, Leader of Opposition, for that fine speech. Do I have the permission of the other panelists to move on with the debate, assuming they're ready?
Yep, fine with me.
Yep.
Okay, sure. Thank you so much. Let's have the PM to continue the debate from government side. Here. DPM, are you here?
All right, can everyone hear me?
Yes, you're loud and clear. Please go on.
Sure, I'll take verbal POIs. Give me a quick second. Starting speech in 3, 2, 1. I would note the absolute lack of engagement to any of Yao Ming's speech material by the LO, because insofar as you bought any of the things that he said in his speech, you will realize that the vast majority of opposition's case has already been dealt with from first speaker. I think the inability for them to properly engage with the round is going to cost them this. Is going to cost them this out round. We have to take the debate. There are a couple of rebuttals I want to get into before argumentation. Firstly, I just want to really quickly deal with the argument of smaller companies having to pay more taxes, therefore leading to laying off your workers. I would just like to note that within the model isn't clear that these are not going to be companies that are extremely small or your sole proprietorships that are run by your singular individual, because these are not typically counted as corporations. Insofar as you're running a particularly small company that's run by yourself specifically, or insofar as you're necessarily running a partnership, for example, I think that these incredibly small companies that cannot afford to pay massive amounts of taxes are going to be exempted from these from these particular taxes because you're a company, but you're not typically counted as a corporation. What this debate had to center around were the private limited companies like Google or Amazon that actively caused a massive harm towards a lot of individuals in your developing countries that you want to protect. I think insofar as you're unable to engage under that framing, you have to lose the round in terms of a lack of impact. But I think second of all, they've told us that they harm workers more because these companies are actively going to lay them off because they can justify cutting off wages and salaries. I think it's completely unclear as to why that was the case, because I posit that if these companies oftentimes make billions in a quarter, I would posit that a 50% tax isn't all that crippling. Yao Ming made the distinction incredibly clear that these companies were earning excessive amounts of money and not typically just enough for them to just sufficiently fund themselves. I think insofar as there is a massive amount of money that they were able to accumulate in a quarter, you would have more than enough money for them to also not be able to justify massively low wages, like incredibly low wages, or continually laying off their workers because you're typically just a big you're just large enough company so that you're able to self-sustain yourself. But I think insofar as well that it did not prove to us why this particular problem was inexclusive, that it was completely impossible for them to take upon the positive comparative either. I would posit that if it's true that these corporations, under their own characterization, were simply just that profit incentivized, then it was unclear as to why exactly these wages and salaries are going to actually be increased anyway on their side. Amazon is a couple billion, is a billion to $1 trillion company that actively makes a lot, even more than a lot of countries out there in the world. They typically will have enough money to fund the vast majority of their workers, but they don't typically do so. Their workers are oftentimes underpaid. I think insofar as even without an absence of a corporate tax, an absence of a global and absent of a global minimum tax, I would posit that these companies are still going to operate under the exact profit incentive that the opposition characterizes. So the inability for you to also guarantee your workers fair wages and fair pay exists symmetrically on your side. I think the ability for us then to therefore not talk about profits, not talk about pay, but inherently remove the political weaponry that these companies use in order for them to evade their own taxes, and in order for them to avoid giving money that the government that is incentivized towards helping people on the ground, to provide more money for funding welfare, provide more money for funding healthcare and publicly available utilities like infrastructure. I think this particular ability for us to prove the exclusive harm coming in from Yao Ming when completely unengaged with. If you wanted to protect people on the ground, it wasn't just talking about the salaries or wages of the workers. It was also talking about which particular individuals were actually incentivized towards helping you. I would posit that if you rely upon the companies that are typically profit incentivized, then I don't think you have any incentive on your side either for any of your workers to get paid fairly high wages. But the final thing that they brought us here was that developing nations are going to be harmed because they actively lose out on the corporations that enter into these countries. What you heard was contingent upon two things. Firstly, they needed to prove that the jobs that were brought to you by these corporations would actually be helpful for them. And secondly, you needed to prove why exactly developing countries actually would rely upon these corporations for a massive amount of development. I would posit that they failed at proving both fronts. Because firstly, insofar as they brought their own characterization on how companies are inherently profit-driven, then let's be real, it was a complete underestimation for Bernice to say that there was just a little bit of exploitation. It looks like being paid peanuts after working 12 to 16 hours of a day in a constant state of suffering and abuse because corporations don't typically want to spend a lot on their safety regulations, etc., etc. Corporations that typically want to pay a lot less upon the taxes, but ultimately disregard for your own worker safety and put you into sweatshops because of the fact that you're typically just seen as someone that is less than a human being as them. I think insofar as it's typically used as a tool by these MNCs entering into your developing countries, you're being constantly exploited and your labor is actively diminishing of your human rights. It was not just a harm that they would be able to disregard on their side. I would posit it was something that it was a massive problem that we had to solve. But secondly, do developing countries really need these corporations to develop? Because as far as corporations go, it's unclear what development you get with a few more buildings and a few more offices. Sure, you get a couple of jobs, but those jobs pay you very little in wages anyway, but also the jobs are like really terrible for your own like labor and workforce. So insofar as your country, as these companies are entering your country because of the fact that you're developing, because of the fact that you have a low labor cost, they have no incentive whatsoever to upskill your labor for you in order to develop your own country. I would posit that instead, the vast majority of developing countries develop by global trade in the agrarian situations that they necessarily give. Insofar as they're able to export towards like their resources towards things, for example, like developed countries by selling their own crops and agriculture, those are the only things that we be able to, like, those are the things that we actually needed in order for us to develop these developing countries. Insofar as we're able to prove to you that the corporate tax doesn't actually like affect this particular level, and like because it's completely unaffected on either side, whether or not these countries are going like on an agricultural level, then I think that the ability for us to still develop these countries was entirely symmetrical, if not even better on our side. We remove the ability for these people to be exploited. If these corporations leave the country, we say so be it. Any points? No, 3, 2, 1. All right, 6 minutes. I think that Yao Ming already told you the fundamental importance of tax and how the government is inherently the best actor when it comes to helping the development of poor countries and poor individuals. Because insofar as the government is the one that is more incentivized towards helping poor individuals because they're elected, it means to say that these are going to be actors that are far more incentivized towards providing things like welfare compared to towards your rich profit incentivized companies that will not provide you with good wages anyway, insofar as you are just an individual working under them and you're just another tool for them to make more money. I think that I would posit then the empowerment of developing countries happen in twofold. Firstly, Yao Ming pointed out the first one, which is the reduction of sweatshops in developing countries. Because we told you why the only reason global corporations enter these countries is because of massively cheap labor costs. And they wouldn't need to pay a massive amount to operate there because I might have to pay a 15% tax back in the USA, but I only need to pay 5% in Venezuela. The structural incentive was simple. They would have to pay a lot more to enter a developing country, and the returns that you would generate is just a lot less. I think it looks like China losing its status as the global manufacturing workshop, and insofar as these particular like labor costs are rising, they have to pay a lot more. I would posit that these companies would want to retrieve. But I think that finally, right, the ability for you to help local companies also particularly exists on our side, because we would posit the main reason for unemployment was MNCs entering and kicking these particular countries out of the competition. Insofar as we're able to prove to you what the individuals that happen on the local level are benefited and they're no longer exploited by MNCs, I would posit that's a positive on the proposition.
Thank you so much, TPM, for that fine speech. Assuming the panelists are ready, can I call on the DLO to continue the debate?
Yeah, can I just get a second?
Yes, sure. Thank you.
Yeah, am I audible and visible?
Yes, you are. Please go on.
Are we going in 3, 2, 1? The moment you let governments top up their taxes and raise them to the global minimum tax, there's the moment you let small companies and businesses who are unable to actually pay these taxes or being charitable, even if they were able to pay these taxes, they're bled dry because of how this tax snatched money away from them that they desperately needed for growth and for development. So a few clarifications here. First of all, we don't have the burden to prove that these companies will actually help these workers get more wages and better pay. This was never solved also on their side of the house as well. We simply want these individuals to keep their jobs and avoid the possibility of them getting cut wages and funding towards worker welfare. This like insurance and medical cards of good offices and infrastructures like in Google and in other companies. This is what we wanted. They try and burden push us, but we don't let that happen. So let me just go on to a few rebuttals. They're talking about how you'll get funding for welfare of individuals. Talking about how this takes place in developing nations and states. It means the amount of capital that is being extracted in the form of taxes is not able to actually fuel the entire progression of the country that they talked about. Because first of all, this money is insignificant to what they actually need. Because developing nations need significantly larger amounts of capital to actually improve the state of their country. We think that the small peanuts that they'll get from this tax is actually not going to help them. Then they talk about how you don't get growth on our side of the house and monopolies will attack smaller companies. Two responses to this. See, this is a very interesting point that was brought up because if you look at the harms, they're symmetrical. Because the moment you top up or increase taxes, you actively deprive these companies from the desperately needed capital that they needed for growth. Secondly, about finally taking their own framing, this is one in which this tax is severely damaging to these monopoly companies. So what does this mean for smaller companies? It means that they'll definitely crumble due to the simple reason, if it's so detrimental to these multi-billion-dollar companies, it's practically the gun that shoots down these smaller companies, depriving developing states and other countries of the desperate economical stimulus that they needed. Then they talk about, do developing nations really need these companies? They say a few buildings won't matter, but I'll be actually integrating my responses and in my arguments, and I'll be talking about how this actually deals with this entire point. But let's just go on to about how they talk about smaller companies will still be able to survive. They obviously cannot survive because this 15% literally means you cutting desperately needed capital that they needed for growth and for survival chances against bigger companies so that they can actively survive in these hyper competitive markets. So let me just go on to my argument about how, first of all, let me just do a few clarifications. These smaller companies are irrelevant because they're not counted as a cooperation. This was something that they talked about, but this isn't true for them because the moment you legally start generating revenue as a business, regardless of size or revenue, it's legally registered as a company or cooperation. Don't let them get away with this assumption. And their side also has to defend. I'll take that later. They have to also defend why taking the trade-off in which it costs smaller companies and businesses that are crucial to economical growth should implode for the narrow-sighted view of side government in which that they make monopolies bleed, but because they think if monopolies are going to bleed, everything else will be solved. So two questions for their side about where are these investments going to come from when external forces who are basically going to contribute investments drop out the moment you topped up these taxes. Secondly, about how did these developing nations get economical stimulus on their side of the house? That they have to answer this question. But onto your argument about how you stunt and kill off economical growth on their side of the house, I'll take that later. First level, about how economical growth is stunted. Firstly, we think that no matter what how much ever aid that they receive, it doesn't change the fact that you need these companies. They're fostered inside these nations in the form of small businesses and companies and uplift the economical state of these nations. Because we think that the moment by establishing we think that the moment they do this is by, for example, establishing low-level trade deals and commercial production ties that are crucial for the growth of the country and are formed only on our side of the house, because investments from giant corporations and developed nations are only going to come in when low tax rates are there, because they're going to look at the profit margin. To expand on this, why do companies and governments invest in the first place? It's because of the low tax rates and high returns that you have in these developing nations. We think the moment that you raise these taxes, all of these potential investors really run away with their money, and actually you deprive these small companies of the desperate investments and capital that they needed. Thirdly, about this means when taxes are going to be lower on our side of the house, this means developing nations get more aid from external sources in which you contribute capital to smaller companies, which helps boost economical stimulus. But when it
comparative basis, what happens is the moment they increase or top up these taxes, my previous speakers framing, let's use my previous speakers framing about what happens. We think that these companies require the capital to maintain growth and their literal existence. So what happens is when you cut off this crucial capital that could have been used to boost these companies' financial and economical stability, that is the moment you topple these companies over. Because we need to understand this isn't just 15%. It's generally like really crucial capital that was needed. Even if it's a small insignificant amount as seen by like other people, it's still very important to these companies because they can literally use it and invest in their literal existence and their literal ability to generate more profits. We think that this capital cannot be cut in the form of taxes because you actively deprive these companies of the growth that they needed. So why is this bad? I'll take that later. Firstly, let's look at the impacts of this. So there are basically going to be three main impacts. So because the lack of economical stimulus kicks these countries down, the people on the ground literally start to suffer because the country literally goes through a meltdown of like the economy. So this basically means that individuals are going to be like literally like losing jobs and basically going into starvation, and other problems are going to be faced. Simply put, people on the ground suffer. Secondly, about how countries take more time to recover from this because the previously existing companies that were supposed to help these countries help this country's terrible economy bled to death, and thus there's literally no stimulus. On their side of the house, you're depriving these developing nations of like the companies that they severely need, and I think the biggest problem is that like you just drive the thing into a worse condition. But before that, yeah, I'll take your POI.
Everything that you're arguing is a wash. Small companies are going to be predated on by bigger companies anyway, and MNCs don't have an incentive to develop your developing countries. What is the comparative is you get governments having more
Yeah, I get your point. Basically, the harms that they all talk about are basically symmetrical because we need to understand about how if monopolies are going to like basically prey on these smaller companies, what's going to happen is that this tax literally kills them off. This tax is like the weapon that is going to be used by monopolies to like put down these smaller companies because they literally have the government doing their job for them, in which they implement this highly uncharitable tax to these smaller companies. They literally kill off companies on their side of the house. Being charitable harms the symmetrical on both sides. Finally, companies are extremely incentivized to not even start, are extremely de-incentivized to start in these countries because first of all, economical conditions are horrid, but because pre-existing companies that were there before bled dry, they're like literally going to be de-incentivized to actively start companies in this thing. And finally, since there are no investments coming in from like foreign actors, there's literally going to be no way to actually boost the growth of these companies and boost the survival chances of these companies. Panel, side with opposition because the moment you opt into government's world, that is the moment you let individuals on the ground suffer, countries go into economical meltdowns, and basically companies suffer.
Thank you so much, DLO, for that fine speech. Now let's have the government whip to continue the debate. Here.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Am I audible?
Yes, you are loud and clear. Please go on.
That's great. Just give me 1 second. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The op would want you to permanently condemn the nations of the developing world to a perpetual cycle of over-reliance on corporations that stifles its transition to tertiary sector at all costs and permanently exacerbated all the exploitation they went through in the very first place. We want in the equitable distribution of tax. We want on prioritizing the development of the developing world in a far more holistic manner. But two crucial things that weren't responded to before I go on into deconstructing their case. A, on the importance of tax and why your equitable distribution only occurs under the 15% tax. I think it was convenient to hear from both Manasvin and Bernice that conveniently your tax is equally distributed to people on the ground, that apparently a tax problem didn't exist, and the fact that your corporations were able to get away with billions and individuals like Elon Musk who went over almost 300 billion was completely okay. But secondly, on facilitating the healthy growth of the developing world and weaning off reliance on corporations, it was simply a wash to push to me that your corporations, which directly stifle your developing world, were going to get away with that and were going to actually help them exclusively when Gelson brought you in his entire speech as to why this was simply untrue. But I'm going to take this down right now into crucial responses. A, on harming individuals on the ground when companies cut back, and B, on how apparently we harm smaller companies. But note the biggest push here was that we actually harm individuals on the ground when companies cut back. The examples they give you are that of like the first world, individuals within human resources. I'm going to deal with the developing world in a second. But onto the first world, we say this was simply untrue. Note crucially, labor unions existed and were highly effective. This looked like America's National Relations Board holding the re-election of labor unions in Amazon against the company's interests, and the pre-existing unions within corporations like Google, which actively enabled their first world population to raise wages and reduce working hours. Their cash cow status relied on incredible reputations of valuing human rights and being a morally good actor, which meant consumers would buy from them, meant they frequently adhered. For example, you get paid maternity leave for mothers and far better insurance among Fortune 500 companies within the last decade. But secondly, the precedence of a 15% tax threatened more if companies misbehaved. This was crucial analysis that went unresponded to, because it was at that moment that companies had an active incentive to be morally acceptable actors. At the point lobbying no longer worked, as their political scapes were primarily left and prioritized the working class, the primary voter demographic in the developed world, where they primarily existed, and the progress of highest taxation was prevalent. Corporations, especially the biggest ones, knew they could be taxed more and feared the outcome dearly if they were to misbehave, because that would be a far greater excuse for corporations to pull more of the billions they never needed in the very first place. Secondly, then, on harming smaller companies, the response here is simple. Next to what you hear on the harms towards everything in the developing world, this was the biggest harm that came out of the op. We take it down. Even your smallest corporations were highly wealthy, hence the title corporations, a massive group with heavy resources. A 15% tax tripled their ability to excessively spend unnecessarily and incentivized these companies to be far more careful with their borrowing habits. If these companies were going to go bankrupt, they never paid tax anyways. Note, if you were losing money annually, you had no earnings. This was tax 101. Note then, government subsidies, things like prioritization and protection policies would also greatly mitigate the harm here, because they were rewarded financially for being good actors who reflected the moral compass of their state. That looked like being given state contracts. That looked like the state prioritizing them as a clientele. That looked like subsidies in many other areas where they actually brought productive value to society. This wasn't a debate about Uncle Ben's kopitiam. At the very best, it was a debate about a group that raked in millions annually and were posing earnings in the very first place. Trying to defend literally any business was the reason they lost the debate. Stop running away from your burden here. Two crucial key clarifications I'm going to make to completely take them out here. Before that, do I have any POIs? No engagement? Fine. All right. Firstly, on how governments are a far better actor in the interest of states and as opposed to corporations. Let's do some basic interest analysis here. Note, your governments were elected into power. Pleasing society was on the top of their agenda. Regardless of political lobbying, it came down to votes in numbers. And the world is seeing a rise in the global left that prioritizes the upliftment of the working class that were previously suppressed. The popularity of Sanders despite far lower political spending, or the consolidation of power by individuals like Nayib Bukele, a young progressive leader in El Salvador, exclusively point to this and tell you that individuals are tired from the lobbying that corporations actively carry out to suppress them. Crucially, corporations make their money in a very different way. This debate centered around the wealthiest corporations, who would either lose or gain the largest amount of money in this debate. They were your biggest stakeholder then. Their corporate goal was simple: profits at all costs. That looked like two things. A, the redistribution of profits through things like dividends directly influence exorbitant share prices, driven up by hyped up investors and consistent record profits. But B, things like returned earnings actually went into the development of resource-intensive and harmful projects that enforce the monopolies of companies. That looked like lobbying against data laws. That looked like better collection and data tracking. These were directly harmful to society and enabling companies to maximize their profits at the expense of people and reduce the tax they had to pay through just the myriad of unscrupulous manners they actively carried out. Secondly, on trend analysis. Note, regardless of what they tell you about your corporations being good, we take this out. This is the biggest benefit they had. Corporations' attempts at being morally good are frequently perverse. First thing here, the achievement of corporations in new sustainable projects and being more climate friendly or uplifting the poor was consistently a facade. Two layers. A, the majority of the good they do are state subsidized by their governments. That looks like despite how rich Google and Tesla are, they're still subsidized for everything they do that is climate friendly through their state's protectionism laws in the development of new projects. But secondly, attempts at bettering society are frequently only to the convenience of convincing their consumers to buy from them. That looks like greenwashing products. That looks like telling people you do things you don't. These are all actively practices of companies. You could never argue that these were good corporations. They had one incentive, that was to make profits. Everything they did was aligned to that. And we see that interest never aligned with the true benefit of society. We clearly edge out here on the state being the better actor. We won the debate already on the primary clash. But secondly, on how corporations undermine long-term growth of the developing world and exploit the vulnerable population. Recognize, winning the clash on developing countries wins us the primary stakeholder on op, the most vulnerable people you like to push. We clearly edge out here. Firstly, the contribution of corporations towards these states and how these harms people on the ground. Gelson already told you that look at your sweatshops and exploitative pay and unsafe working conditions. But note then, your shitty pay is often rewarded by states because they were still jobs in the state that the state no longer had to care about and could no longer be accountable for. Note then, people didn't work your jobs because they were happy. It was because they had no choice. You excuse the state failure. Secondly, the economic reality of these states. Note your corporations gradually create a monopoly of over-reliance. Corporations create jobs. They don't build your economy with the shitty wages that you pay your actors. Majority of your state wealth is made from things like global trade and sale of resources. Anyways, your corporations hate this. Over the past decade, you've seen them gradually creating an over-reliance on these very corporations and condemning individuals to the primary sector because the moment developing states transition into the tertiary sector and start going to intellectual fields, they are no longer profitable to corporations for their desperately needed labor-intensive jobs. We clearly edge out on the equitable redistribution of tax. We clearly edge out in incentivizing far better corporate behavior and enabling the healthy growth of the developing world. We clearly won this debate. I've never been prouder to propose.
Thank you so much, Government Whip, for that fine speech. Assuming the panelists are ready, I want to move on to the opposition whip speech. Here.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are loud and clear. Please go on.
Okay. Wait, just let me get my timer. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. We are opposition cater best towards developing nations because companies can see potential in developing countries and therefore indirectly also help the people on the ground. We are the ones that don't kill off small companies and cater best towards both actors of this debate. I'll be doing 3 things in my speech. Firstly, I'll be rebutting whatever the self-government has said. Secondly, I'll move on to clashes. And thirdly, I'll explain what we have brought to you on the side of opposition. So firstly, on rebuttals, right? The first speaker of government tells you that larger companies have the free ability to hoard and monopolize many other small companies. We think that the government only increases that monopoly because many small companies or potential companies that could have created competition are now cut off from even establishing a proper business. Rich companies might be affected, but with time, they can still continue to earn more revenue because they are profit incentive and they are big companies, right? Smaller companies can't. They actively destroy people who are trying to start their own business, which already goes against their stance of protecting people under their side of the house. And then they told you about how big companies are going to strip away the rights of workers. We told you from opposition that we think that the abuse of workers will only increase under the government, right? Because the more they take away from companies, the more companies will force workers to work for longer hours to gain more profits because they've already told us how companies are profit incentive. This leads to many companies squashing more trade unions because companies are profit incentive and would therefore have the incentive to exploit their workers in order to gain more profit under their side of the house. They don't solve any of their problems. In addition, they remove funding from working conditions of companies or infrastructure, right? Because not only are they removing funding for good working conditions and good quality of people working under their company, but they're actively okay with doing it as well. And then they told you how they're going to help the poor under their side of the house. They gave you a one-liner that the government has the incentive to help other countries. However, they never gave you any structural analysis as to why this is going to materialize in the long term when there is a crucial problem of life and death in developing nations, right? I'll take one later. Their methods of helping the poor are immoral in and of themselves because not only do you kill future entrepreneurs or not only are governments not that incentivized to help developing nations, which I'll explain later on, but you actively allow small companies to lose capital and harm those people who are trying to start up their own business, typically those who are under the middle working class population. Sure, it might help prevent monopolization of bigger companies, but there are many other small companies out there that don't have the capital to pay for these taxes. Their first speaker even said for themselves, if small companies are affected, then so be it. We find that morally abhorrent, right? Then the second speaker came out to tell you how small companies aren't part of this whole tax thing and that small companies are exempted. This doesn't make sense because we already rebutted you by telling you that small companies are still counted as businesses the moment they start to actually make revenue and earn an income from consumers. Small companies are under their tax because the government won't make exclusions to particular companies. Small companies are still affected under their side of the house. They can't just cherry pick certain examples and get away with it, right? So in their setup, they kept telling you how companies earn billions of dollars every year from exploiting the working class. This just shows you the importance of having small companies to exist and create competition to reduce that monopolization and give them the incentive to better their products or lower their prices that creates utility, right? This is true because it's going to take a toll on all the resources of small corporations that can be used in research and development. Instead of paying taxes, they could be using it to focus on the small companies themselves, which allows it to become bigger and also help to reduce the amount of monopolization, right? So like we on our side best cater towards small companies to earn profit, right? And then so then they told us how developing nations are harmed under our side of the house. Note that they haven't dealt with this on their side of the house as well, because these companies need workers to earn revenue because they can be the potential or the fact that developing nations have low tax rates, right? Companies will have to pay these workers anyway because if not, they don't gain revenue. People under our side of our house at least some sort of stable income, right? Because in addition to that, there are, for example, rules and regulations in place, and we believe that if they do start to turn exploitative, accountability can be taken into effect, right? The third speaker told you how labor unions existed already, right? We tell you that this is not mutually exclusive to their side, right? We can have trade unions under our side of the house as well. However, only on government do you actively take away money from working conditions or decrease the quality of workers' rights because they actively want to, right? That's what makes them so morally unjustified because they're going against who they're trying to help in the first place. And they told you how companies are going to exploit anyway, and that all of our benefits aren't going to exist. Note that especially in the modern century, companies do need to act in a certain way, or society will call them out and hold them accountable, right? Taking away the money will suddenly lead them to having less capital, which only leads to them exploiting workers even more under their side of the house. Before I move on, I'll take a POI.
Very clearly, we are not killing small companies, and this is still unproven. 3 opposition speakers in. We are talking about companies that make billions of dollars in revenue. How do you expect us to defend taxes that kill small companies when we can't tax them in the first place?
Because under your side of the house, this global minimum tax thing applies to everyone in the country, right? Because small companies are still companies that earn revenue and are still companies that make taxes, right? Small companies are still part of like the population who need to earn revenue. And if you want to tax bigger companies, you indirectly also tax smaller companies, right? Which I think like is morally abhorrent for government to say in the first place, right? And then also told you how, in developing nations, states are much more better because they're like governments and they actively care for their country, right? They never explained why governments have the incentive to help other countries that aren't their own. Companies do have the incentive to go with other countries that have low tax rates, right? The states have, like they told you that the states have failed you, but then they have the incentive to help you, which is like a contradiction that does have the house. They cannot like on one hand say that states have failed these people without any context, which we assume is corruption and a bad system, and suddenly want to claim the benefits of states having the best incentive to revive their people and being able to establish it well and reform the following system, right? This is detrimental to their case because their whole case is premised upon these taxes actually materializing in order to improve the like quality of life of working classes, right? And no POIs. So now we're moving on to clashes. There are 2 clashes in this debate. First is which side do we help small companies, and secondly, which side helps people on the ground more. So first, on which side do we like help small companies? Like government keeps telling you that small companies are exempted, they're not like allowed or like even need to pay this tax because they prevent because they don't have to, right? We on opposition told you that on their side, do companies still continue to exist? Because even if you buy that, small companies don't have to pay these taxes, right? These larger companies over time still can earn revenue because they still profit incentive. Because they're driven to earn profit, they still continue to exploit their workers. They still continue to abuse workers, right? So that they could gain more revenue, right? More of this happen because they have decreased revenue for major corporations, but they also harm many other small companies that could have helped with competition, literally kill off competition to happen in the first place. We think that they don't solve this problem of like exploitation and monopolies either. We told you, however, that small companies can thrive on the outside of the house because they are not instantly killed off. That is the comparative. They can grow on our side, and in the future, they can compete with major corporations. This monopoly will be worse on their side because even if companies are taxed, they have a higher revenue than everyone else. So not as impacted as badly as small companies, right? So in conclusion, we've proven you on opposition how we help people on the ground more because we prevent monopolies, we encourage competition, we do not tax people, we do not like abuse workers, right? Or like reduce the amount of like quality of working conditions, right? Which I think is what is supposed to be debating about in the first place. And with that, I'd like to end my speech. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Opposition Whip, for that fine speech. Now let's have the reply speech from opposition side. You have 4 minutes and 15 seconds to round up.
Give me a second. I'll be going in 3, 2, 1. The moment you opt into government's world panel, that is the moment individuals have their wages cut and benefits revoked because companies could not even afford to pay them these benefits due to the increased taxes. The moment you side with them, that is the moment you kill off these small companies which acted as the main actors which contributed to the economical stimulus of the country. So let me just call them out for a few things. They first of all skewer the meaning of cooperations. It basically means legal businesses that earn revenue. So don't try and dramatize this for your benefits. We really need to understand that was the actual meaning of this word. Then they say crippled states have the investment to help. This is obviously not true, first of all, because even if they wanted to help, they can't because of lack of capital. But moreover, they've got other problems to worry about, such as the health situation in their country and many other problems such as job loss and other things. We think that they don't, even if they had the incentive to help, first of all, they can't, but moreover, they have other things on their plate to handle as well. Then they cannot just, on one hand, claim that states have systems that fail the people while trying to claim all the benefits of a state that genuinely cares about bettering the lives of their people. This is detrimental to their case because the entire premise depends on the taxes actually materializing and creating utility. We get no clarifications from them about this. We need structural analysis that we desperately do not get from their side of the house. So let's talk about the developing nations economy and how about which side benefits them better. They talk about how you make monopolies bleed so they basically have less money to go after smaller companies and labor unions. First of all, there's a lack of analysis about how this is actually going to be impacted on their side of the world. But let's look at what monopolies are, panel. Even if you cut their profits, they have pre-existing capital which can be still used to put down movements and other companies because there's still an immense amount of money that can be used for this. Finally, we need to understand, regardless of even about the amount of capital that they have, this doesn't change anything from what they actually are. They're predatory firms, and out of spite and out of revenge and out of other factors, they're likely to put other companies down because that's what they want to do and that's what their entire narrative is in status quo. But what we tell you on our side of the house is about how smaller companies on their side of the house will be affected in today's debate. Government tries to downplay the harm of taxes, but we tell you this is simply untrue because the 15% is still going to take a very significant toll on these small companies. But taking their own framing, if this tax is so significant and so damaging to big companies, then recognize how detrimental it's going to be to these smaller companies. The mitigation that government tries to do about how these taxes are going to be that effective is really bad for their side because we need to understand about how they try and skewer the meaning and downplay and mitigate the harm of taxes. We've clearly told you the importance that it's important for them to have these resources to come up to have these resources to come up with market disrupting technology and better services. They cannot get away with only telling you that they're going to survive because they're going to be using the profit that they've got in the first place. But let's just go into an explanation of our points about how firstly actively disincentivize companies and countries from investing in these third world states. First of all, companies are likely to have invest in the first place because first of all, developing nations have low taxes. So because they want a higher profit margin, a higher return rate, they're obviously going to be investing in them in the first place. And then companies can drive and get immediate capital whenever they need. Secondly, about how this also helps people in developing nations. By companies coming in, it allows people to get more job opportunities on our side of the house. So basically, they're on their side of the house, individuals are more vulnerable, economically unstable and financially low. We would rather have them take the basic necessities rather than suffer on their side of the house. We think on our side of the house, individuals actively benefit from the situation because they're giving job opportunities and they're given benefits. Then finally, about how this kills off small businesses on their side of the house. Taxes are super high. So first of all, these small companies are forced to pay these large amounts of taxes, which are detrimental to their existence. And it's harmful because first of all, basically monopolies don't generally have much of a backlash from this. But moreover, you're not able to form things such as trade alliances and commercial lines, which could actively have helped them a lot. You stunt economical growth on their side of the house, in which basically there's no investments coming in and there's no one basically able to actually invest in these companies. No more companies are going to be formed because these pre-existing companies died out, and we think the lack of economical stimulus puts individuals on the ground in pain and the economy suffers.
Thank you so much for that fine reply speech from opposition. Now let's have the last speech from government side. Here.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
You sound faint. Could you speak louder?
Is this fine?
Yes, it's much better. Thank you.
All right, cool. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. I hope the op will read a dictionary because it wasn't us that skewered the meaning of a corporation, it was you. But the thing that killed the op wasn't just basic English, but the fact that everything they argued resulted in a wash. Nothing they said about SMEs could have been better on their side because they predated on those particular corporations regardless. Developing countries would never be developed by your MNCs, but in fact were the ones holding them back by cracking down on your human rights and your labor laws. Manasvin didn't get my point when he cut me off with my POI because the only things they wanted to engage upon were washes. They ignored every exclusive benefit we brought to you from first speaker and lost the comparative. That was the government's path to victory. We have to take the quarters. There are 3 issues that I have in this speech that we have to take upon. Firstly, how do you help the average worker? Secondly, on which side do you support developing countries better? Finally, this really quick thing about small companies. I think in terms of average worker, I would note how inconsistent the op is here on this contention because it appeared to be a massive argument in Bernice's speech, but it was dropped in Manasvin and Kate's speech as well as the reply. I would posit the only thing they really managed to tell us here was the moment that corporations and companies needed to pay more for their own taxes, they would effectively cut off and lay off their workers in that sense. I think quite immediately we disproved that because we told you that for companies that earn millions per quarter, 15% isn't so crippling to the point of destroying them, so they would be hard-pressed to justify the pay cuts and massive amounts of laying off valuable employees that actually feed towards their own profits and efficiency as a company. But what is a clash? With the plethora of substantives that we gave to you that went completely unengaged with. We told you that the government was a far better actor to help poor individuals via welfare because they were elected by the people. No response. We told you companies would never pay you highly regardless because of the very profit incentive that drove the op case. No response. We told you that you would still have jobs because governments that have more money to fund public infrastructure projects will lead to the creation of jobs for people on the ground. No response. What made up the comparative was the contention on wages was a wash at best because their own analysis about laying off workers wasn't even proven because 15% is substantial, but it's not crippling to the point where you can justify this. But what we could win upon was the government getting far more ability for you to fund things like welfare and actively provide for poor people on the ground. So poor people will still be existent on either side because it's still yet unclear as to why the wages on opposition are still going to be any better regardless because of the analysis that we brought to you from the Gov. But on the Gov, we have a way to help these poor individuals via welfare. On the op, they're left for dead. We take the clash. The second issue here is developing countries. The new material the op brings is that MNCs will help developing countries because they saw potential in developing countries. The first structural analysis as to why developing countries are going to actually be helped by MNCs, by the way, but it directly contradicts the characterization from LO, who already told you why you are literally only here because of cheap cost and the fact that you don't need to pay as much for labor. We gave you 2 things to say why that was good, and that insofar as these companies left the country, it would be nothing but beneficial. Firstly, these companies do nothing but exploit your labor for the sake of human exploitation. It involved the imposition of sweatshops upon your workforce and led towards massive amounts of work hours for the sake of very little pay. It doesn't matter how much sort of principle you would be able to get. I think insofar as the human rights were being disregarded by these particular companies that entered into your corporations, kicked out all of your local companies and inserted themselves into the local competition, I would posit that it's just simply abhorrent for these MNCs to remain here. But secondly, these MNCs are not even needed because we proved why why there is no incentive for them to develop you anyway, insofar as you are only here because you are a developing country and it's in their interest to keep you poor. But insofar as we told you that the vast majority of developing countries actually develop via global trade with companies, via global trade with global superpowers or developed countries through their own agrarian economies that remain unaffected in this round, I would posit the ability for us to also develop remain a wash. The comparative here was it was never the burden for the Gov to prove we catalyzed the development of these countries, but it was a win on our side because we were able to take out the exploitation that MNCs brought towards these countries. Final thing on small companies. I think op needs a read on the different types of businesses because corporations are a conglomeration of different large companies like your sole traders or your local mama. Literally the dictionary definition here. So it's not to say that these are going to be companies that are going to be killed off because they are not conglomerations, they're not corporations, so these are not effectively part of the round. I think that insofar as opposition never really managed to tell us why exactly any of the things resulted in a positive clash. We were able to take upon things like far better government funds, far better welfare. We actually help the poor people. We want on basic English. Go for the pro.
Thank you so much for that fine speech from government side, and thank you so much everyone for the interesting debate. So I wish you good luck in the breaks and also for the